You are listening to From Embers, a weekly show on CFRC 101.9 FM about anarchist and anti-authoritarian ideas and practice. We are broadcasting from the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples on land that has come to be called Kingston, Ontario, Canada, because of the thievery and brutality of the Canadian state and its empire-loving parents. From Embers is about fires, some real and some metaphorical. Fires started generations ago and tended to over the years. Little sparks all across this territory that we hope will grow, spread, and engulf the thieving state called Canada and the capitalist system that has plagued this land since the fur trade. I've been thinking that From Embers could use some more historical perspectives. And when I was putting together a May Day episode a while back, I remembered that May 2019 is the 100th anniversary of the Winnipeg General Strike. I've mostly seen the strike brought up by labor activists and occasional socialists as an example of both the power of collective worker organizing and of the brutality of the repressive capitalist state. I wondered what lessons the largest autonomous worker action in Canadian history might also have for us. I also thought it would be good for us just to think about what being in the streets alongside comrades might have felt like 100 years ago. What we share and what we don't share with these people from the past who, when we learn about them in school, can sometimes seem impossibly far away from us, perhaps not even real. The way we learn history in state-mandated education is dry, boring, and constructed to paint us a picture of a progressive march towards the liberal capitalist democracy that we now inhabit, painting all victories as building blocks of today's apparently enlightened society, and all defeats as either just or as tragic products of a repressive era gone by. I reached out to Sean Carleton, a professor of history out west who I'd been following on Twitter for a while, to talk to us about the Winnipeg General Strike. Sean is a member of the Graphic History Collective, a group of people who make comic books about labor and anti-capitalist histories. He's also a historian of settler colonialism and Indigenous resistance in so-called Western Canada. The collective has just published a book about the strike to mark its 100th anniversary, and Sean had a lot to say about the story of the strike. Fortunately, he was also super willing to talk about the present, to draw us some comparisons and give us some things to think about when we reflect on the relevance or not of labor and workers' struggles, and more generally about how we might organize mass actions that could fight to win. Somewhat ironically, as I was conceptualizing this episode, a call went out where I live for a general strike against Ontario's right-wing Doug Ford government on May 1st. Organized entirely on Facebook and involving no actual withholding of labor, as far as I can tell, that action was a far cry from the stories Sean has to tell us from 100 years ago. But I wonder if a moment like this one, where here in Ontario, a right-wing government is attacking workers and poor folks in far more overt ways than others have before, could be the catalyst for such a generalized revolt as the Winnipeg strike. If that feels unfathomable to us, I wonder what it is about 2019 that makes it so. Here's my interview with Sean Carleton of the Graphic History Collective about the Winnipeg General Strike of 1919.
My name is Sean Carleton. I'm a co-founder of the Graphic History Collective and an assistant professor at Mount Royal University in Treaty 7 territory in what is now known as Alberta.
And briefly, what is the Graphic History Collective?
So the Graphic History Collective is a network of artists, activists, and academics that create social justice art. And our projects aim to showcase hidden histories, inspiring histories of marginalized groups and people striving to create a better world, primarily looking and using the medium of comics. And our comics, in short, show that you don't need a pair of tights and a cape to change the world.
So I wanted to talk to you because it is the 100th anniversary of the Winnipeg General Strike, and your collective recently put out a comic about the strike. Can you, for our listeners, explain what the Winnipeg General Strike was?
Yes, the Winnipeg General Strike indeed has its centenary this week. It actually starts on May 15th, 1919, and the kind of short version of what the history is about, or the quick version, is that in May and June 1919, 35,000 workers in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Treaty 1 territory, and the homeland of the Métis Nation staged a 6-week general strike, a general sympathetic strike. Workers from various backgrounds struck for higher wages, collective bargaining rights, and to demand more power for working people broadly understood. And ultimately, the strike was violently crushed by police, the Royal Northwest Mounted Police and special constables in the city, on orders of politicians and the city's capitalists organized in this group called the Citizens Committee. And although the strike ended in defeat, in fact, they did not win their demands in May and June 1919, the strike was not a failure. In fact, it really demonstrated the power of working people and have inspired generations of workers to carry on the struggle to build a better world, and in particular to use the strike, the withdrawal of labor power, as the ultimate weapon of working people to demand and to build that better world.
How did that come to be? Like, what was Winnipeg like in 1919? What was it about that particular place, those particular conditions, that allowed such a massive worker action to happen?
Yeah, we've been thinking about this for a couple of years, trying to get our heads around, why this massive strike, one of the largest and longest strikes in Canadian history, happened. And I think to answer that question, I'm going to give you two parts. What most people will say when you ask them what caused the Winnipeg General Strike is they'll give you an explanation of kind of class polarization in the city of Winnipeg leading up to 1919. And we need to remember that Winnipeg was one of North America's largest cities at that time. It was Canada's third largest, and it was a major industrial center. And historians have made the argument that for a variety of reasons, there were tensions and class polarization in the city between the largely immigrant North End and the wealthy South End of the city. And these kind of tensions were exacerbated by the First World War, where many soldiers went off to fight what they thought was a war to create more democracy. And in reality, it was just another imperialist war who was going to control empire and colonization on a global scale. So when the soldiers returned home, their promises of greater power, democracy, etc. were not met. In fact, soldiers experienced high rates of unemployment, rising inflation, all the while, the so-called titans of industry that had stayed home to produce the war machine were profiting greatly from the production of war-related materials, and that class polarization only gets bigger. That gap between the rich and the poor gets bigger. And out of that grows the demand, if going to war and asking politicians to make a better world isn't going to work, then working class people are going to withdraw their labor power and use the power of solidarity to make those demands. But one of the things we do in the book is we also challenge the way in which we understand this history. Because, as I said, most historians just focus on that class polarization. But in our book, 1919, A Graphic History of the Winnipeg General Strike, we also connect the kind of class polarization and inequality and class inequality to the longer history, the wider context of colonization in Western Canada. And one of the things that we try and foreground in the book is that class antagonism, class polarization doesn't come out of nowhere, right? Winnipeg as a settler city is organized in particular kinds of ways that both support settler colonization and facilitate unequal capitalist relations, right? And so one of the other things that we try and do is connect that class polarization to this longer history. In fact, we make a number of different points suggesting that we need to connect that earlier history where only 34 years separate the Canadian government sending Gatling guns, the militia, the Royal Northwest Mounted Police to contain and go to war against the Métis and Indigenous communities, and sending the Royal Northwest Mounted Police into the streets of Winnipeg to crack heads and facilitate capitalist accumulation. So we need, in our view, to connect both of those parts. We need to understand how Winnipeg as a settler city was created, which sets the stage for those class inequalities. And then we need to understand how those inequalities and polarization was accentuated by the First World War and that kind of growing frustration that plays out in a larger worker revolt just after that war.
Do you think that those connections were felt in the moment? Like, I guess the question maybe is like, what is the connection? Like, what is the impact of the formation of Winnipeg, of settler colonialism on those workers in 1919? How does Canada as a settler state, or that place as a settler-dominated space, impact the strike itself?
Well, there's been a lot of really great work done on some of these questions, both the overt direct connections, as well as some of the absences and erasures. People like historian Adele Perry has written a really great book called Aqueduct, which looks at the creation of Winnipeg's aqueduct. Just before and during the Winnipeg General Strike, the city of Winnipeg is creating a major land loss for the Shoal Lake 40 First Nation, essentially taking away land and access to clean drinking water to facilitate, the clean drinking water of the city of Winnipeg. And she makes a number of really important points about how we remember 1919, right? We often talk about the strike, but we don't talk about the aqueduct. And she also talks about some of those missing connections, that these processes were going on at the same time, and yet we often sort of miss the opportunity to talk about these things as being informing and mutually reinforcing. Owen Taves has written a book called Stolen City, which is about the connections of between colonialism, capitalism, and racism and the formation of Winnipeg. And he has an interesting chapter where he explains that when we talk about the Winnipeg General Strike, we often highlight the solidarity that's going on. And we can talk about that in a minute. But, originally the strike, the General Strike, is only 11,000 people. But it balloons to 35,000 people because largely unorganized immigrant workers and women who had been left out of the traditional labor unions join in solidarity, right? So it's this fantastic story of solidarity, and yet at the same time that workers in the city of Winnipeg are finding new ways to work in solidarity with one another, for the most part, they're ignoring what's happening to the Shoal Lake 40 First Nation in their struggle. And one of the points that we try and make in the book is that in reflecting back on this history 100 years later and thinking about how we can use that history to inform new kinds of activism, we need to make sure that our struggles connect different issues and that we find ways to work together and make sure that nobody gets left behind. So I think making those connections are important today because in the moment, many people didn't make those connections, although, they were intimately, the processes were informing each other.
Do you have any particular stories that you like to tell about the strike, or examples of solidarity that did take place in Winnipeg in 1919?
One of the interesting stories is that when we talk about labor history, we often focus on interesting labor leaders and workers that participate in the strike. But it's also important to understand the power dynamics at play. And one of the things that we do in the book is also talk about who was involved in the Citizens Committee of 1000, the reactionary political organization of politicians and capitalists in the city. And in particular, we focus on one individual, A.J. Andrews, who was a lawyer and played a leading role in this organization. He was the one that was very much in favor of using violence to crack down on the strike. He, in the end, was the lawyer that prosecuted a number of the strike leaders who were arrested in an attempt to delegitimize the strike and take out its leadership. And what we focus on is when we were doing research on Andrews and the people that were involved in this committee is that, and this comes in some ways from Owen Taves's research, that a lot of these people actually come to Winnipeg originally to fight Riel and the Métis and Indigenous communities in the War of 1885. And so there's a direct connection between a lot of these politicians and capitalists in Winnipeg being a part of first dispossessing Indigenous peoples of their land and going to war against them, and then creating the city of Winnipeg and benefiting off of that dispossession to create capitalist accumulation, etc., and then using their power and influence over the city to then crack down on workers when they try to change the direction of how capitalism was being organized in the city. And I think that that's really interesting, that Andrews, 34 years ago was coming out and fighting Riel, and he's at the helm of the secretive Citizens Committee that is authorizing and very much in favor of using violence to crack down on workers on Bloody Saturday. Let me see what else. What other stories could I share with you that people will find really interesting? One of the things that I'd like to emphasize is the role of women during the strike. Often the way that labor history, particularly in the popular realm, gets romanticized is sort of white British trade unionists, a handful kind of leading the strike. And one of the things that is really important about what happens in Winnipeg is a number of different people play important roles in what's happening. Sometimes those get lopped off in the way that we remember the strike. But there were a number of women at the heart of what was going on in Winnipeg. For example, the first workers to go off the job in Winnipeg in 1919, in early May, were female telephone operators, women telephone operators. So the general strike was set to begin on the 15th of May at 11 a.m. And what happens is that the women decide to not show up for their shift that started at 7 o'clock. So effectively, they're the first ones to withdraw their labor and kick off the Winnipeg General Strike, which is really interesting. So kind of cutting off that communication in the city. And then a number of prominent women play very important roles throughout the strike, including people like Helen Armstrong. Helen Armstrong was the leader of the Women's Labor League in the city. And she plays a number of roles, including organizing women, encouraging them to participate in the strike, to withdraw their labor in solidarity with the strike. She also helps organize soup kitchens. She ensures that very poor workers and poor women workers in particular had a roof over their head. They had enough food to eat during the strike, because we need to remember that at this time, there's no like strike pay or, a lot of these people that are going on strike don't even have a union. They are, putting, their livelihoods at risk for the greater good of the strike. And so people like Helen Armstrong play really important roles of mutual aid and support, and in trying to bring as many different people, even if they were historically marginalized from the labor movement, into the general strike. Because the more people withdrawing their labor power, the more you have a stranglehold over the city. So I think that that's really important to highlight, those important roles. And so I think that those stories are really important to highlight and to bring along with us as we go through the centenary of the strike itself.
What kind of organizing do you think went into the general strike, and who was playing what kind of role? Like, were there unions in the background? Were there radicals? Were there like other kinds of forms or committees?
The organizing during before and during and after the strike is very complex. It's hard to understand at times, but there is a tendency to think that general strikes are spontaneous events that just happen. And in reality, I think there was an element of spontaneity in this, particularly the groundswell of support, where you actually had 2/3 of people on strike not part of officially recognized unions. I think that is an important element to understand. But we do need to remember that there was a lot of organizing going on in the city of Winnipeg in the years leading up to the strike. So you could go back to, there were big strikes in 1916 and a strike of city workers in 1917 that really showcased, I think, the importance of battling bosses together. So rather than taking on particular struggles employer by employer, there's a growing understanding in the city of Winnipeg during the First World War and just after, that the way to win is by working industrially, right? So trying not to play into the boss's strategy of divide and conquer. So trying to find ways to broaden the way in which you organize your union and to strengthen your voice. So there's a lot of organizing in the city before the strike about trying to grow that industrial power. So moving somewhat away from the idea of craft unions to big industrial unions where you had larger groups of workers that were forcing industries to take notice. And so what happens is that the Winnipeg General Strike starts on May 15th, but actually the building and metal trades are the catalyst for the strike, because in April, they are negotiating with employers and demanding that they be able to bargain collectively. So bargaining collectively is a bit different than collective bargaining, which a lot of people think, oh, the strike was about collective bargaining. It was about bargaining collectively, but not about collective bargaining. What the metal and building trades wanted to do was negotiate as an industry so that it wasn't, shop by shop. They knew that if all the building and metal trades could organize and bargain as an industry, they had more power. And of course, employers didn't want to do that. They would rather, hive off different shops and different groups because they weren't as powerful that way. So what happens is the building and metal trades, those negotiations don't go very well, and they decide to go out on strike on May Day, 1919. And based on some of the organizing in the city previously, the building and metal trades asked the Trades and Labor Council in the city to go out on a general sympathetic strike to broaden the power of workers in Winnipeg. And around this time, 100 years ago, between about May 11th and May 13th, the Trades and Labor Congress holds a vote of unionized workers and has an overwhelming mandate to go out on a general strike. I think 94 of 96 unions that had affiliated with the Trades and Labor Council in the city decided to go out on strike. It was something like 11,000 votes for the general strike, 500 or 600 against the strike. So what starts as a building and metal trades dispute to organize industrially all of a sudden builds into an organized general strike. And from there, the strike continues to grow and get more support, because at the same time that unions are struggling for collective bargaining, a number of different groups of workers in the city, particularly Ukrainian and Central and Eastern Europeans living in what was then the North End, or known as the North End, they saw a moment that people fighting for collective bargaining, right, and withdrawing their labor power to grow the power of labor and working people in the city, they wanted to connect their struggles of poor wages, inadequate and unsafe and unsanitary working conditions. They saw common cause in the idea of a general strike. And so there's a lot of organizing that needs to happen, right? People that had been traditionally marginalized from the general strike are now meeting with trade unionists, and they're figuring out ways to continue this general strike. It takes a lot of work to ensure that a group of 35,000 workers can effectively shut down a major industrial city in North America. During the strike, there was a central strike committee that was trying to make decisions and find ways to empower as many people who are on strike to be part of the decision-making process of what kind of tactics were being used, what kind of demands were being foregrounded. And the inspiring part, I think, which shows this level of participatory democracy, is that almost daily there would be these large gatherings in what at the time was known as Victoria Park. There would be 5,000-10,000 people that would gather to hear updates about the strike, to make decisions, to talk about the conditions of working people in the city and what might need to be done. And I think that was an extremely liberatory moment for a lot of people. Right? They got into these big spaces and they could feel that power. Right? If you've ever been in a large demonstration or a large gathering of working people in the thousands, there's an energy to that, and people started to see, wait, like, yeah, we control communication. If we don't make the food, nobody eats. There's this really inspiring realization that labor creates all wealth. All wealth should belong to labor. Like, there are these really inspiring moments, and that got people wanting to play a more active and engaged role in the strike. And then, of course, afterwards, right, the strike does get crushed by the state, and many people splinter in their thought process as to how do you continue to build on the momentum of the strike. Many people go into the labor movement and try and push for industrial unionism. Some decide to go into politics and pursue the ballot as the ultimate strike or the ultimate weapon to strike at the heart of capitalism. So there is a number of different kinds of organizing that happens in the aftermath of the strike as well.
You are listening to From Embers on CFRC 101.9 FM in Kingston, Ontario, Canada, or you might be listening to the podcast edition of From Embers on your phone. We are talking with Sean Carleton, a historian of Western so-called Canada, about the Winnipeg General Strike, a massive workers' revolt that took place in Winnipeg, Manitoba, with massive support from elsewhere in 1919. We are currently in the midst of the 100th anniversary of the Winnipeg General Strike, which lasted for about 6 weeks. And Sean is talking to us about what happened in 1919 and what we can learn from it today. I guess this is like a more basic question, but how in 1919 did people even self-organize? Like, how did people know to go to that park and speak to each other? How day to day did people find news about what was happening in other workplaces? How did people know if others were on strike? Like, what was sort of the means by which the strike was actually like practically organized day to day? Obviously, they were not on Twitter, you know?
In the days before social media, how do you find out how you organize? There's not an event invite meet at Victoria Park to hear about what's going on. So to me, one of the things that was fascinating about the research that went into the project is we really needed to get a sense of what were the tactics and strategies of workers at that time? How did you share information? How did you network and bring people into the movement? And one of the things that the strike committee does very early on is they form a press committee, and the press committee puts out a strike bulletin. So the strike bulletin was produced daily during the strike and has a number of updates and information about events, and it was really the main form of communication for workers, right? Aside from these big mass gatherings in Victoria Park. Sometimes these would be announced in the strike bulletin, a big parade to be organized tomorrow, et cetera, et cetera. And they really had to battle the control of the bourgeois press. The Citizens Committee of 1,000, a group of politicians and the city's capitalists who wanted to undermine and break the strike, had their own newspaper, the Winnipeg Citizen, which produced a number of reactionary, very racist stories about the strikers as being enemy aliens, et cetera, as a way of trying to delegitimize the strike. And so the strike bulletin plays a really important role of trying to inform and keep working people organized.
And what about outside of Winnipeg? Were people aware of the strike? Were there actions in other places to show solidarity?
So one of the things that people understand about the strike is that Winnipeg is such a big strike and such an important strike that it almost takes a lot of attention away from the fact that the conditions in Winnipeg were very similar, although different, to conditions across North America. Right? There was an even bigger strike in Seattle in February of 1919 over similar kinds of issues, frustrations over the First World War, war profiteering, rising unemployment, poor wages, poor working conditions, etc. And the people in Winnipeg were obviously inspired by that big strike, as well as other global events like the Russian Revolution in 1917, the German Revolution in 1918. And so they're drawing on all of this experience and trying to put it in motion in their own struggle in the city. And consequently, people around what is today known as Canada started to be inspired by what was going on. And there were actually a number of sympathy strikes in sympathy with Winnipeg, but also about addressing the working class issues in different cities. So there is sympathy strikes in Vancouver, Victoria, Calgary, Edmonton, Brandon. I believe there's one in Toronto and on the East Coast. And so workers across the country take the spring and summer of 1919 as an opportunity to both display their solidarity with the workers in Winnipeg, but also to use the strike, and the sympathy strike in particular, as a weapon of withdrawing their labor power to protest and demand better conditions for themselves, which is, I think, a very inspiring moment. And the reason why that's so important to understand is it's not just about Winnipeg, it's about this general sympathetic strike wave, is that after 1919, bosses and politicians across the country pinpoint the sympathetic strike and the general strike as something that needs to be crushed. And they start to pass labor legislation, offering the labor movement a number of concessions in order to essentially put restrictions on general strikes and sympathy strikes. They're essentially outlawed in Canada today because they are so successful. And while the Winnipeg General Strike was not successful, it scared the ruling class and politicians enough to try and put limitations on workers' ability to strike in sympathy with each other.
Can you explain how long the strike went on and ultimately how and why it ended?
Yes, so the Winnipeg strike The building and metal trades workers go out on strike on May 1st, and a general sympathetic strike begins on May 15th. And ultimately, the strike lasts for 6 weeks and ends on June 26th. And the reason that it ends at that point is the strike continued to build and grow momentum, and the city's capitalists and politicians really wanted to find a way to end the strike before it really could be more of a symbol for workers across the country. The Prime Minister at the time, Robert Borden, sends Arthur Meighen and Senator Gideon Robertson to the city to play a more interventionist role in trying to break and end the strike. And essentially, they are the Citizens Committee of 1,000 and the federal government representatives are looking for an opportunity to crack down on the strike. And as the momentum for the strike is building, returned soldiers or veterans who, for the most part, supported the general strike because they were frustrated with post-war conditions. They organize a silent parade for Saturday, June 21st, to show solidarity with the strike. And the mayor of the city, Charles Gray, did not want to have more parades because parades and demonstrations were gaining support in favor of the strike. So he bans parades, and the soldiers decide to do a silent parade anyway. And on the morning of June 21st, workers and people in Winnipeg start to gather around Portage and Main, the downtown's kind of core area, in anticipation of the parade. Before the parade is about to begin, a scab-led trolley car is driven through the streets. So the trolley cars had been shut down previously, and so scabs brought the car into the heart of this protest, and workers were very frustrated by this. They took it as a deliberate affront to the strike and what the strike was about. And the Royal Northwest Mounted Police and special constables in the city take the tipping of the trolley car as a provocation to essentially use the state's monopoly on violence to crack down on the peaceful protest. They, in the end, shot and killed one person, Mike Sokolowski, and wounded another person by shooting him in the legs. And this person later died of gangrene. And they, for the afternoon of June 21st, which became known as Bloody Saturday, effectively ended the strike with violence. The Northwest Mounted Police and the special constables broke out an open class war in the streets of Winnipeg, and the militia was called in at the end of the day under the order of General Ketchen to basically show workers and the city of Winnipeg that the city was taken back from worker control. And so at the end of the day, with people actually dead and injured and arrested, the strike committee decides to call off the strike on June 25th, a couple of days later, and the strike officially comes to an end on the morning of June 26th.
Was the Winnipeg General Strike in any sense like a legal strike in the way that we would understand it today? Like, was there labor law equivalent to what there is now? Were there unions who had some kind of legitimate mandate to be there?
It's a complicated question because one of the things that's happening in the 1910s is the Canadian government is trying to create a form of legal recognition for unions, right? In the 1880s and 1890s, and even early 1900s, battles between bosses and workers were not necessarily regulated in overt and clear ways. And employers would hire thugs to simply beat up on workers who were on strike, to beat on people who were picketing, for example. There was no legal recourse if you went out on strike or you formed a union and your employer just simply fired everybody. There was kind of murky legal legislation. And one of the things that happens in the 1910s, 20s, 30s, building into the post-war, post-Second World War period, is the state tends to offer a number of different concessions. So they implement different kinds of labor legislation, which recognizes workers' right to unionize, for example. But increasingly, what ends up happening, particularly after the strike, is that in order to get some of those protections from the state, workers have to agree to kind of blunt their power, particularly by agreeing to curtail their right to strike. So, for example, in the years after Winnipeg, leading up to the current moment, one of the problems is that you can only legally strike at particular points, right? At the end of a collective agreement, for example, after a union, a vote, et cetera, et cetera. These kinds of legal constraints and freedoms, right? Because labor legislation is, in fact, a double-edged sword. It protects workers on the one hand, it removes their ultimate power of striking on the other. This kind of legal framework is still very much in formation at this time. So there are some unions who are legally on strike, following the strike protocol set out by the city's Trade Labor Council. But what's fascinating is that we need to remember that the power of the general strike in Winnipeg was based on the fact that 20,000 non-unionized workers walked off the job. Many of them lost their job as a result of their solidarity, but they were not legally caught up, right? One of the things that labor legislation today does is that anybody who goes out on strike, can be prosecuted legally. Without that labor legislation, you don't have those protections, but you're also free to join in solidarity, to strike, to withdraw your labor power. You have more freedom to do that. And I think that was one of the important factors that went into the Winnipeg General Strike in 1919, is that many workers were not legally protected, but because they also didn't have the same constraints on their ability to withdraw their labor power and strike. And that's why I think one of the things that we talk about in the book and what we want people to learn is that workers need to find ways to challenge the legal constraints put on workers' ability to strike in this country, because it's our ultimate power. That's why the bosses and capitalists come after it. And so we need to be able to push back and regain that ability to go out on strike for better wages and working conditions, but for a whole host of other reasons. If the federal government sends in the police to unceded territory to build a pipeline without particular kinds of consent and consultation, we should have the ability to strike because we don't like the actions of an elected official, for example. But increasingly, the right to strike has been curtailed precisely because it's so powerful. And we're hoping that people can learn from what happens in Winnipeg and be inspired to get back that militant perspective on trying to regain that power and use it to build a better world.
Despite the context being clearly very different, what moved you and your collective to share this story now in 2019, besides the obvious fact that it's a centenary, so maybe it just feels symbolically valuable? Like, what lessons do you think you're hoping to bring into this moment in particular?
I think that, well, of course, the centenary makes the story of the Winnipeg General Strike interesting to many people. We have been talking about doing something about the Winnipeg General Strike for many years. And I think it's because, and this came out more as we researched the story and the kind of conditions that led to the strike, that a lot has changed in 100 years, but there's still many of the same issues that are going on today. if I were to talk to you about, a strike that happened because of corrupt politicians, high levels of class exploitation, the growing gap between the rich and the poor, rising prices of goods without a corresponding rise in wages. I could be describing 2019. And I think that that's ultimately why we were so compelled to tell this story, is that right now in the 21st century, people face many of the same frustrations, the same inequalities that workers did in 1919, but we don't have that same organized energy to think about withdrawing our labor power to deal with those issues. And we think we can, by understanding how workers 100 years ago leveraged their power and found ways to work together in important and inspiring and yet still incomplete ways, we think that we can learn from those lessons and build towards a more powerful resistance in the 21st century.
Do you think that the strike also holds lessons for those of us who are not like labor activists, like for broader social movements, perhaps revolutionary movements? Is there something to be gained from reading about the strike, even if we're not in a union, even if we don't think of our workplace as the place where we want to organize?
Absolutely. I think that's one of the things that happens in Winnipeg, is that it starts as a labor movement strike and develops into a much larger revolt that brings different groups of people who wouldn't necessarily see themselves as hanging out in the Union Hall at the time. It inspired a lot of people to figure out, how does the society that we live in work, and how can we effectively marshal our power? And filmmaker, activist, rapper Boots Riley of The Coup was in Winnipeg just this past week, and I had the opportunity to hear him speak on the Winnipeg General Strike and its lessons for today. And he gave a really interesting and inspiring talk that was challenging people who are not necessarily in the labor movement or think of themselves as being in the labor movement, to figure out how you can leverage power in our society. And one of the things that the organized left lacks in many ways, and I include myself in my own organizing in this, is a real commitment to moving beyond small groups of performative demonstration, and so his challenge was, how do you continue to work in the different movements that you're in, and ultimately figure out, how do you win? Like, are you interested in registering your discontent, or are you wanting to win? Those two things don't necessarily need to be separate, but often we focus on one and not the other. And I think what the Winnipeg General Strike serves as a model of what can be accomplished when different groups of people find ways to work across their differences. There were socialists, more conservative trade unionists, people that were not involved in the labor movement whatsoever, but were pissed off about poor wages and working conditions. And they found a way to work together and to build the power of a general strike. Like, we can't think of that today, right? Our big demonstrations, if we're successful, have 1,000 people. But 35,000 people withdrawing their labor power and shutting down the city is a much more effective way. There are, of course, divisions and problems, and we need to make sure that we don't romanticize general strikes as a cure-all, right? They're a lot of work. They take a lot of organization. We're not going to agree on the tactics and strategies that are required. But there is something, I think, in this idea of how can we find ways to work together that is extremely inspiring, and I think very informative in our contemporary moment of, how do we win today? And I think that while the general strike doesn't provide a blueprint, it certainly offers a number of important lessons that activists, both within the labor movement and those that organize outside of it, I think can draw inspiration from and hopefully create some important conversations and dialogue about what do we do to win today.
Do you think that the specific tactic of withdrawing labor holds the same power that it did in 1919?
Yes and no. So I would say that in terms of yes, capitalism still, despite its numerous changes, still works the same way. It ultimately is the product of profiting based on exploitation of people's labor. That labor looks different, the kinds of exploitation and the ways in which it's organized are different, but that fundamental relationship is very similar. So the withdrawing of that labor power plays a very similar role. It is a direct attack on, it gets to the very root of what capitalism is about. Without labor, there can be no profit. So in that way, the ability to withdraw labor power is the same. But it's also not the same because in the 100 years since the Winnipeg General Strike, bosses and capitalists have been very successful at organizing and finding ways to work together across their differences to ensure that the workers' movement continues to be blunted through a variety of tactics, through accenting divisions, through racism, homophobia, divisions in terms of young workers versus older workers, pension, people that have pensions, people that don't have pensions, et cetera, but also using the law as a way to increasingly contain labor and to bring them on side with facilitating capitalism. Right? The labor movement had a moment in the early 20th century where it could be an effective way of challenging the economic order of capitalism and what capitalists and the politicians they work with. What they realized is that if you give working people crumbs, they will take them. And those crumbs also are used to kind of contain and disempower the workers' movement. And it's not, I think, unsurprising that one of the key things they did is come after the power of the strike, because they know that they need workers to make their profits. And the ultimate weapon of working people is to not work in a capitalist society. So they put limitations on the ability of workers to strike and effectively outlaw the ability to strike in sympathy of other workers. And if we want to win, if we want to build and continue to grow our opposition movement, one of the things that we're going to need to understand is how can we regain our ability to strike, and how do we push the boundaries of solidarity, and how do we challenge the legal limitations and restrictions put on that solidarity.
Do you think that the organizations that we have today that make up what looks like the labor movement, so like, I guess, unions, their federations, and maybe some anti-poverty NGOs and their people resemble the organizations that made the general strike happen? Like, do you think that that is where that power lies, is in those organizations?
It's a good question. I think one of the lessons of the strike is that bosses and employers really feared industrial unionism. And in many ways, the organizations that we have today have lost that idea or spirit of industrial unionism, and instead have accepted a kind of labor movement that is very much focused on individual unions and their collective bargaining agreements. And we've lost that larger vision of a unified working class, or at least a working class that can find ways to support each other. And instead, we've bought into the kind of piecemeal bargaining, union by union, that really disempowers and limits our opportunities for solidarity. I think that the labor movement today has accepted a seat at the table of capitalism, right? And they're really trying to be service organizations to increase the benefits and the working conditions of their members. They're not as concerned about the wider working class. And of course, there are some unions that are better than others. There are some union leaders who do understand that. But on the whole, the terrain of class struggle has been tilted in favor of capital and politicians, and the labor movement, in return for a number of benefits, have bought into that system. And I think right now, what we're starting to realize is that we deserve better and we need to demand different. And that's going to take a lot of work and a lot of organization from people both within the labor movement and those who organize outside of it to try and find a way to get back to leveraging our power in a capitalist system, which is finding ways to not work as a form of protest.
Okay, tell me about your book. Tell me about the comic. What should we expect if we pick it up?
So the 1919 A Graphic History of the Winnipeg General Strike book was created by the Graphic History Collective as one of our titles, and was illustrated by David Lester, who is a punk legend, a member of the band Mechanormal, and illustrator of a number of different projects, including the graphic novel The Listener. And essentially what we wanted to do as this kind of collaboration between activist academics and activist artists is to package the lessons of the Winnipeg General Strike and offer them in a new medium, so not a long academic book, but in a more short, accessible comic book or graphic novel that would inspire and connect new generations to the lessons of the Winnipeg General Strike. So it's just over 100 pages. It's digestible in a short reading, and it will give people both the basics on what the strike was about, its causes, and inspire people to think about its legacy and lessons for activists today.
Cool. And how can people find it if they want to check it out?
So the book is available anywhere you can get books. We encourage people to seek out their local independent and radical bookstores and ask that they order in a copy or two. And we're doing a spring and summer book tour. We launched the book in Calgary on May Day. We were in Winnipeg doing a launch just last week. We're in Halifax on May 15th, which is the actual centenary of the strike. And we're in Vancouver on June 7th at the BCGEU regional area office. And all of those dates and information of how to connect with us actually in person is found on our website, www.graphichistorycollective.com. And you can also buy the book directly from the publisher. The book is union printed, and Between the Lines Press is a co-op publisher, and you can find them at btl.com.
That's all I've got for you tonight on From Embers. I hope you enjoyed tonight's show. If you want to find out more about the Graphic History Collective or Sean's other work, you should check out the show notes. I'll post a whole bunch of links. As always, if you want to get in touch with us at From Embers, you can email us the old school way, fromembers@riseup.net. Thanks for listening.
The border is not just a wall. It's not just a line on a map. It's a power structure, a system of control. The border does not divide one world from another. There is only one world, and the border is tearing it apart.
The Ex-Worker Podcast presents No Wall They Can Build, a guide to borders and migration across North America. A serialized audiobook in 11 chapters released every Wednesday. Tune in at crimethink.com/podcast.